Hi everyone, this is InDesign 1. We're in week 14. This is webcast 4, the last of our special effects webcasts. This one is going to focus on something that we call the transparency blend space. And I think as we've gone through these different effects, it's becoming more and more apparent why InDesign has to give us an obvious clue when a page or a spread has transparency of any kind applied to it. And since we know now that all of the effects that we can apply in InDesign are based on transparency, then when we see this, for example, in the Pages panel, these little checkerboards to the right telling us that there's transparency, we need to pay attention to those pages for all the reasons that we talked about. Let's say that only 2 of my pages had transparency. Those are the 2 that I would want to be sure that I tested on whatever device was going to be the output device to be sure that those transparency effects are going to look the way I had hoped, the way I'd planned, the way I saw them on my screen. We didn't go over some of the other effects, but as I told you, we've got several others here. Many of them are very similar, and you can play around with those and see what you get. It'll be fun to investigate those. But I want to bring up another reason why we have to be very cautious about transparency. When you create a document, you give that document an intent, which determines its default color space. And you all know this. If you just think back, when you created a document, you tell InDesign in the new document dialog whether the intent of this document is to be print, to be web, or digital publishing. And depending on which one of these 3 you choose, you're going to set a default color space for that document. Now this particular document, I can check to see what the intent was by going to my File menu and choosing Document Setup. And under Intent, I can see that it's specified as print. That means that when I open my swatches panel the very first time, it is going to have a few default CMYK swatches. No RGB, no LAB, it's going to be all CMYK. But you also know that InDesign allows us to work in multiple color gamuts at the same time, unlike some other applications. So if I look at my color panel, I see that I can create CMYK swatches, I can create LAB swatches, and RGB swatches. So I could potentially have RGB swatches sitting in the same document on the same page, interacting with a transparency effect with one that is CMYK. I could have an RGB image interacting with a transparent word that happens to be defined in a color that is CMYK. When you think about this, the fact that the blend colors and the detail need to interact, you can see that InDesign is going to need some consistent color space to work within. So because of that, we have something in InDesign called the transparency blend space. And if I go to my edit menu and I look at transparency blend space, I can see that this document is currently set to CMYK because it was originally intended to be a print document. At least that's what I specified when I created that document. What I want to do now is show you what happens if you have a transparency effect on a page, what it will do to those elements that are not in the same gamut. So I have 2 pages here. I have one page that has RGB swatches, and then I have another page that has CMYK swatches. There is no transparency applied to this page, and I can verify that by looking at the fact that I am on page 8, and page 8 doesn't have a little checkerboard to the right, so I know that there's no transparency. what I'm going to demonstrate here is the color shifting that can happen when you have RGB colors defined on your page and you apply a transparency effect and you have a CMYK transparency blend space. The type of shifting that we've been talking about all along this semester when we go from one gamut to the other is going to be a lot more apparent. Remember that the RGB color space, that gamut, is far larger. It incorporates far more colors than the CMYK gamut does. So what's going to happen in most cases is many of the RGB colors are going to shift to their closest CMYK counterpart. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to first show you the RGB swatches. You can see they're very bright. And I'm just going to apply 1% of a transparency effect to this black swatch. And that's all it takes, is applying one transparency effect. Now, as I do this, I want you to focus on these 6 swatches to the right, the color swatches. Right? So I'm just going to make this opacity 99%. Get ready. I'm about ready to press my tab key. Watch those colors, and boom. I'm hoping everybody noticed that these went from these really bright RGB colors to their closest CMY counterparts, which are much duller. Imagine if this had been an RGB image. Some of the colors are not going to change because those that are not going to have any type of a shift will look exactly the same. But those that are outside the CMYK gamut are going to have to shift into something that the screen can represent. Now I'm going to undo that. I'm basically removing the transparency effect from this black box. And I'm going to move to this next page. And these swatches are all CMYK. I'm going to change my transparency blend space from CMYK to RGB. And when I apply that same transparency effect here, watch the colors, and you can see that really none of these happen to shift. And why is that? That's because the CMYK colors usually fit quite comfortably inside of the RGB gamut. Remember that RGB gamut is a much larger gamut. It can include far more colors than the CMYK. Had I chosen the CMYK that was out on the edge beyond the CMYK, then I would have seen a color shift. But I'm not seeing that color shift because these colors all fit within the RGB color gamut. So just be aware that when you're using an effect, you are not going to have a choice about these color shifts. That's going to happen if you are, let's say, using RGB colors and you are in a CMYK blending mode. The other thing that might happen is you might get a transparency blend error message. And I want to try to demonstrate this. Let's change the gamut. Let's be sure that it is the transparency blend space to CMYK. All right. Now, I'm going to export this to the PDF that's the smallest file size. And by default, that's going to change the colors, any CMYK colors, to RGB. And I know I have transparency in this document. Let's see what happens. I go to File, Export, and I'm going to create, let's see, blend space. Just export it as that. Click Save. And I'm going to change the PDF preset from high quality down to smallest file size. If I take a look at my output, I can see that the destination profile is sRGB. It's no longer CMYK. Had I chosen press quality, that would be CMYK. Now when I click Export, and I think let me go back to General just to be sure that all pages are selected. They are. All right. Take a look at Output. I'm going to click Export. Other than the fact that I have overset text, here comes my transparency warning. The document's transparency blend space doesn't match the destination color space specified in the Export Adobe PDF settings. To avoid color appearance changes in the PDF, click Cancel and change either the document's transparency blend space or the destination color space. Or click OK to continue with the current settings, which means that I might get some shifting. Since I'm going to an RGB color space, I might get some shifting, but probably less than had I been thinking that I was an RGB and I was going out to CMYK. So hopefully this is going to give you a little bit more understanding about this warning. It'll alert you to the fact that this is going on in the background, and you can make a more educated decision about how to handle this. All right, last couple of things. I'm going to go ahead and click Cancel and not make this PDF. A couple pieces of advice that you've heard before, but I'm just going to repeat them as the closing of our effects webcast. Always try to keep your text frames as the top element. And it's not hard to do. Very often we don't have to deviate from that because often the text we want to show up. But part of that is that we want to keep our vector objects on top of the rasterized objects. If you have to deviate from that, that's fine. Don't let that impact your design creativity, but just be aware that you really should see a sample of that if that's what you choose to do. If you have used transparency, again, ask for a color proof when going to a professional print shop. Often, if it comes up, if a set of transparency effects causes a result that you are not happy with, often a print shop can go back and just load a different PostScript driver and it'll fix it. But they need to be aware that you're not happy with that effect, and they can talk with you about it. Show it to them, tell them what the problem is, and if you are using a print shop that's using the latest version of InDesign, they probably have the latest PostScript drivers, and they will be able to fix that problem or adjust it so that it comes out the way you would hope. And if they can't, they will explain to you why. But I think you're better off going to someone who has the more recent versions than going to someone who's telling you have to save this back to a version of CS3. That's probably not going to be able to handle the transparency in a way that you want to, especially if it's a creative and a complex design. All right, I'm looking forward to seeing how you use these effects according to the instructions for the next lab, which is going to be Lab 13. And again, this will be your Bodhi cover page. Have fun. All right, until next time, signing off.